minute to make sure that everybody who is coming has a minute to enter.
Hi, John Mason from Philadelphia checking in.
Hi, John.
Hi, you're Amanda Berman. Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you too.
Hi, Amanda. Hey, I wanted to ask something. Is it really necessary to record this meeting?
I think so. It's like it's kind of like keeping minutes. It's not like an archive. I'm a history student, and I think it's great to have an archive available.
I'm sorry, who's speaking?
John Mason from Philadelphia.
Do I see you?
The reason,
I'm right here.
yeah,
Can you wave? Because I don't see you on the screen.
there are more people than can fit on the screen, and the reason we recorded is because there are a lot of people that wanted to join that aren't able to join us at 1 o'clock on a Friday. So yes, we do have to record it.
Okay, I just, okay.
Lauren, should we start?
Do it. So I wanted to kick us off by saying thank you all for coming. Friday afternoon is hectic for everyone and especially for Jews. So really excited to connect with you all at this moment. I know, everybody's been having the same week. It's been a really intense time, and coming together as a community is a really valuable way for us to strengthen each other. I'm so excited to introduce today Amanda Berman. She's our founder and executive director. For those of you who haven't yet had the pleasure, you will see when we hear from her in a moment why she is the founder and fire behind a movement. I call her the OG Zioness. I'm sure I'm dating myself generationally with that term, but really now is a moment for that fire, that love for the Jewish people that is willing to make you brave in places where you would normally just want to go about your life and not have to explain to every person who's going to troll you what's going on with your people and why you care about yourself and your own safety and the rest of the Jewish people. But I'm sure all of you know or have some sense of why we do that and why we believe that it's so important. So what I'm going to ask right now, we're going to hear from Amanda about the state of our movement. And while she's talking, if you have a question for her, please put it in the chat. Daryl and I will be monitoring the chat. And when she's done, we're going to have just a couple minutes to answer some questions. So we may not be able to get to all of them, but we do want to have some ability for you guys to reach out so that we can be communicating and responding. And again, thank you all for coming. So Amanda, take it away.
Thank you so much, Lauren. First I want to really take Lauren's point about the OG Zioness. It's really not me. There have been so many Zionesses before me and before Zioness was an organization, because the Jewish people have long been deeply committed both to progressive values and to Zionism. And you're all here, I think, and hope because you are committed to those values too, and because you've been looking for an organization, a community, a movement that allows you to participate fully and authentically in the domestic movements that matter to you, fighting for social and racial and economic and gender and environmental justice in America without abandoning any piece of your identity as a Jew or a Zionist in the process. And this has been, obviously, for so many of us, a really challenging month. We're really happy for those of you who are new, who are joining us now. There are more than 1,000 people who are joining Zioness chapters just after the last few weeks. And our organizing team, Lauren and Daryl, shout out to you guys for doing incredible work in helping train people and activate them and put them in their chapters and launch the chapters. We're launching 5 new chapters. We're in the process of launching 5 new chapters just based on the last few weeks. And that is because since Zioness has existed, the demand for the community that we are creating is far beyond our ability as a small organization to even harness. And these are the moments, these are the opportunities where people become more and more aware of the challenges that we're facing as a people. Zioness launched in a similar moment to this after me personally and so many people that I knew feeling excluded from the domestic justice movements that really mattered to me, that I had always been a part of. Being a feminist is something my mom raised me with intrinsically. Being committed to racial justice and environmental justice and activism, these are a core part of my identity. And I often say, and for people who have heard me speak before, you've heard me say that I was a Zionist from the moment that I was born, because my grandparents bought Israel bonds for my college education, and I was invested in the state of Israel. Because as American Jews, we are invested in the state of Israel in some sense, just by virtue of being Jewish. There is a really pernicious form of anti-Semitism, and we've all experienced it, and it exists in the left, which is the ideological home of the vast majority of American Jews. And there's been a conversation that's been going on within our community and externally as well about where the anti-Semitism is worse. Is it worse on the left? Is it worse on the right? How do we fight it? Unfortunately, what I saw before Zioness is that everybody, my sound is cut off. Can people hear me? Okay. That unfortunately everyone was pointing somewhere else and saying the anti-Semitism is worse over there. I can't tell you how many people on the left told me the anti-Semitism is worse on the right, and they point to Charlottesville and Pittsburgh and Poway and January 6th. I also can't tell you how many people on the right tell me the anti-Semitism is worse on the left, and they talk about BDS and anti-Zionism, which I put in quotes because that to me is not a real legitimate thing. So I don't think we should talk about anti-Zionism without quotation marks. People point to the identity cleansing of the left that requires us as Jews, as has historically been a reality that we have faced, requires us to abandon a core component of ourselves and our identity in order to fit in order to be welcome. And there was not a place for me. There was not a political home where I could be confident and proud with my full authentic self and say, not only am I a progressive and a Zionist and I'm going to find a way to make those two identities come together, what I actually believe, what I feel in my heart is that they are deeply intertwined, that my Zionism is a result of my progressive identity, that because I care about fighting for justice and human dignity for all people, I care about Jewish emancipation after thousands of years of persecution. Zionism is the original progressive movement, and the Jewish people are the world's most enduring persecuted community. 4,000 years, we have wanted to have a sovereign state, and we've had it twice in the past, and it's disappeared. And what I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize is that we've taken it for granted. And that for a lot of American Jews, we've grown up in a world where there is a strong Israel, and we haven't actually realized what that has meant for us in the diaspora, that we are strong and successful and thriving in the diaspora because we know we are safe simply by virtue of the existence of the state of Israel. And so, being part of the progressive movements here where I live and work and vote, where I show up as a woman, as an American Jewish woman, because my bodily integrity and autonomy is on the line, and I don't have the luxury of ceding these movements to bigotry. They matter. They matter for me. They matter for the people I love. They matter for my Black and brown friends and for my LGBTQ friends. They matter for immigrants and refugees. Every Jew in the world knows their family's immigrant and refugee story. So for someone to say that we're not allowed to participate in these movements because we're a Zionist, it doesn't make any sense. But a lot of people have never met a Zionist, right? They may not have ever met a Jew. And if they did meet a Jew, that Jew was likely not talking about Zionism because we don't appear in the world confidently as Zionists. We kind of keep that to ourselves. And what's happened is that people have perverted that term and they've weaponized it against us and our people. And we cannot allow that to continue. We need to show up in the world as Zionists and tell our friends, our colleagues, the people that we are allies to and the people that we want to be allies to us, what Zionism means to us. How you can't attack Zionists without attacking Jews. How you can't say you are anti-Zionist, that you think one state in the world should cease to exist and it happens to be the Jewish state without having an anti-Jewish bigotry problem. We need to talk about how anti-Semitism and its incarnation in the left of anti-Zionism, how it is systemic and institutionalized in the same way that anti-Black racism is. And when we're talking about making sure that we're fighting all forms of bigotry, we have to insist that anti-Semitism be part of that. So I'm so grateful that you're all here. As you all know, I could talk for a very long time, but we have a jam-packed program for you. And all I really want to say is that if you are already part of a chapter, thank you. And please help us build your chapter, grow your chapter, get into action, find colleagues, build coalitions, fight for justice, and bring all of our values with us at the same time. If you're not in a chapter, please do reach out to us so that our organizing team can connect you to your chapter, help you reach out to your contacts and build that chapter. And the more involved you'll get, you'll see we do lots of events. We connect chapters together. We are doing, trying to replicate successes. You're going to hear from some of our really incredible chapter leaders today. And hopefully you'll get a really great flavor of what it is that we do here at Zioness in this critical moment. So thank you so much again for being here.
Okay, so Amanda, I just want to share with you the question from the chat, and I'm going to kind of pull a thread that's in the question because I think it's a really large issue that a lot of folks on this call and in our movement are wrestling with. When groups that we support, that we have rallied with and marched with and stood with and whose missions we really deeply care about, speak out in support of anti-Israel rallies or causes, use language that denies the right of the state of Israel to exist, or says that anyone who believes in the state of Israel can't possibly be a progressive, can't be a part of their movement. How do we respond? And how do we continue to work towards the shared missions that we have with these groups without sacrificing our sense of self and our identity?
This is the question of the day, right? And I'm really glad that whoever asked it, I'm sure it was asked multiple times. And I don't know that I have the answer, but the answer that I will tell you is that being part of Zioness is part of the solution to this problem. Because again, the people who are holding a view that the Jewish people are not entitled to liberation don't know anything about the Jewish people and Jewish history, and they don't understand Zionism, because the people who have been in those spaces, again, have been perverting the term. I don't know how many of you know this, but the Zionism is racism resolution is Soviet propaganda that has invaded our progressive movements. It's destroying the movements. And when we show up and we say, when you kick Jews out of these movements, you are harming the integrity of the movement. You are telling committed activists to stay home. You are telling the people who built and led every progressive movement in the history of this country that we are not allowed to participate. That is not the way to advance our shared goals. The thing is, and I know this is a really painful and traumatic moment, and so I hope that everyone understands where I'm coming from when I say this, we can't just sit and talk to ourselves about how afraid we are. We need to reach the audience of people that don't understand us, who don't know anything about Jewish history or the Jewish story or Jewish persecution or Jewish trauma or what Zionism means. And by the way, I don't view Zionism as a modern political movement. I view it as a core component of the Jewish identity. We are the children of Zion. Everything about Jewish identity and Jewish religion and Jewish peoplehood centers Zion. The only thing uniting the Jewish people in the diaspora for thousands of years is our longing to return to Zion. So when we only talk about it as a modern political movement, we're actually erasing a huge part of Jewish history. And so it's so important for us to be there and have conversations, not with the people who get it, not that there's anything wrong with leaning on each other, which is why we're building this community so that we can all support each other in this work. But we need to go out into the world. There are only 14 million of us in the entire world. And if we're not telling our story, it will be told for us. So what I would say is it is really painful when movements that we want to support take positions that are an existential threat to our people. But if we're not in those movements, there will be other people there and they will be speaking for us, and it will become an even more dangerous situation. So we need to get past that feeling of, well, they haven't stood up for us, so we're not going to stand up for them. Tikkun Olam for most Jews is a mandate. It is not a thing that we can put aside. And if we're doing that work that we feel so committed to, that again, affects our lives in the country where we live, the progressive movement makes sure, well, hopes to, if it's successful, hopes to make sure that we can pursue justice and equity for every person in this country. That affects those of us on this call and all the people that we love. So we can't sit it out. But also when we're bringing our Zionism with us, we can change the conversation that's happening there. And anyone who's been part of Zioness for some period of time, hopefully pre-COVID, when we were doing more direct action, knows how successful we can be when our activists, and again, you'll hear from some of them, when they're trained and they know how to engage and have these conversations, you can literally see the change that you make every single time you show up. So let's do everything we can to get through this moment, to deal with the pain and trauma that we feel, but get to the other side of it and get back to work, do the things that we care about doing, make our country stronger and better and more equal, and make sure that we're fighting anti-Zionism in the process.
Thank you, Amanda. Okay, at this point, I'd like to introduce Daniel Eisenberg. He is a specialist in intergenerational Jewish trauma and has done this work in a number of settings. He's worked with us before. And one of the things that we feel is really helpful for our activists and ourselves is that as we do this work, we identify the ways in which the thing we're fighting against is creating harm, how that affects us, and how we draw on each other and our tradition to sustain ourselves so that we can continue this fight and continue to make the just communities that we want to make. Daniel? Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Daryl. Thank you, Amanda, and the other Lauren as well. I really appreciate being here and connecting again with this community. I just notice in me a feeling like just hearing the passion with which you speak, Amanda. It really moves me to hear that. And I'm just, happy to be here with you today. I'm just going to put my stopwatch on so I have some awareness of the timing. And amazing, 118 people all gathering today on a Friday afternoon before Shabbat to come together. And so I spoke a few weeks ago at another national call, and some of you may have been present for that, some may not. So I'm going to give a brief reintroduction to some of the basics of trauma and intergenerational Jewish trauma, and then deepen some of those aspects and some things that even I've been reflecting on in the past few weeks, and some deeper reflections. And then I'm going to talk about resilience and strategies that we can use and you can use to cope with the effects of the trauma responses. And so that's the little plan for the next 20 minutes or so. Does that sound good? Yeah? Okay, great. Are there chapters in Europe, Germany specifically? That I don't know, but it's a great question. So trauma, it's a word that's used a lot. It's become a kind of buzzword recently, and I think it's good to kind of look at the etymology. Where does that word come from? It's a Greek word, trauma, meaning wound. So when we think of trauma, trauma is wounding. And initially, when psychologists first started talking about trauma, it was really thinking about car crashes, natural disasters, kind of events where people's physical safety was compromised in some way. War was obviously a very big area where trauma was spoken about. And one of the threads that unites these experiences, be it a tsunami, the experience of war, having to flee, or be involved in a car crash, or experiencing abuse in a relationship, all these different sites of trauma, of wounding, they share with them, for the person being impacted by it, a sense of being overwhelmed and a sense of losing agency and something very powerful coming at them and actually being unable to withstand the power and the force and the abusive intensity of that impact. And as I said last time, a lot of the research on trauma really focuses about how it affects our body. And so it doesn't always go through the mind. It's not always a cognitive process. Trauma happens to us and our body kind of stores the trauma. There's a very famous book by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score, where he speaks of how trauma is really stored in the body, and he interviews various people and many studies that he's done looking at how people who've experienced trauma sometimes may say, oh, I'm feeling fine, everything's okay, but their body is actually full of tension. And when they really tap into what their body's feeling, a lot of the traumatic responses are stored there. So that's just something important to note, that connecting with how our body's feeling, if anyone has been feeling cramped or tense or short of breath, your body might be speaking and responding to some of the trauma of the past few months, where there's been so much complicated content online and in person that's definitely been igniting stuff for Jewish people. And I spoke last time about trauma responses, and I want to just deepen a little bit into that. The basic trauma responses that the initial researchers did was talking of these three main ones: fight, fight, flight, and freeze. They were the three main ones based on on studies that were conducted mainly of men who'd served in war. And the research on this showed that most of the men who were interviewed and researched after they'd been in war either sort of froze up from all the tension and the trauma of the war, or fled and had to just run away from it, or they were like, I need to fight even more. And they were the three main responses. However, other research that's been conducted later on has seen that actually this was quite a male-dominated view of trauma response. And whilst these responses 100% can be true for people of all genders, the deepening of understanding trauma responses, looking at more women, understood that actually, and also looking at different cultures, that there are many, many different responses to trauma. One of them that was highlighted in some research was around women actually really at a time of trauma, gathering those that they love, gathering people together and building community is actually a form of trauma response. And not only is it a response, it's also highly resilient. And this is what we're doing. And I see this is also a women-led movement. And so bringing people together and gathering those that you love is a form of trauma response and a trauma resilience. I also notice as myself as a gay man, in the gay community, when there's been, big sites of trauma, one of the responses has been to really exceed in joy and party and have like amazing flamboyant fun. That's also a trauma response, to just really have so much fun and just party and party. That is a response. It's beautiful. It serves a purpose, but also behind that, there might be something as well. And there might be some pain and some grief behind that partying and that joy. So all of you are engaging in this activist work. First of all, I want to say I feel for the tension that you're sitting in. I feel for the tension that you're in. And as Amanda was speaking, something came up to me about exclusion and just the particular quality of exclusion in the intergenerational history of Jews. That so much of anti-Semitism throughout history has been about excluding us, telling us we're not welcome, telling us you don't belong, telling us you can't be here. And it can manifest itself in very deep ways in our personal psychology as feeling that we don't belong, that we're not actually, we don't even deserve to be on this earth. That's the most extreme manifestation of it, to not feel that we're even worth being alive. And so when people exclude us, it's very, very painful. And it could be even in a social group. But any form of exclusion, if you've had that history, really touches on something very deep. I hear Ms. Shapiro saying, right, like we belong nowhere. And that's also why Zionism is such a huge question, because Zionism is also about belonging and connection, and it brings up all of those questions for us. And I know in my family history, my grandparents were living in Leipzig in Germany, and the thing that my grandfather said was most painful for him in 1935 when the Nuremberg laws were passed, more than seeing physical violence, was his non-Jewish colleagues in the fur trade where he worked in Leipzig telling him they no longer could do business with him. They said, Mr. Eisenberg, we don't want to do business with you anymore. This law has been passed. We can't deal with you. And the pain for that, he said, it broke his nerves. It was like a shot to him. And that in some ways carries through the generations, through my father, and then into me. And the inheritance of that trauma is psychological, and also there has been research that it's also genetic, that our genetic makeup is actually impacted by the transmission of this trauma. It's amazing work by Rachel Yehuda, who's done really incredible work looking at this process called epigenetics, which is about the way that trauma is passed through the genetic line. I'm hearing John, I'm just wanting to respond in the moment, does not experience trauma, but rather frustration because we're yelling, kicking, and screaming. So I would say that the word trauma might not be the right word for you, but that frustration and that yelling and kicking and screaming, something in there I see of the fight response. I see something of that response which is touching on something deep. And to just differentiate the trauma I'm speaking of, it's not the same as someone who has PTSD. It's not the same as someone who has directly experienced a car crash or who was in a tornado or something like that. It's a more subtle form of passed down trauma that we're speaking of. And therefore, when we feel like we're screaming into the void, as Romi's saying, that is, to me, a sign that something very deep is going on and that there is an intergenerational response happening. And I completely I hear Rick saying, no trauma here, just a deep concern about the persistence of anti-Semitism and the Jewish community. Totally. And if trauma is not the right word for you, I completely understand that. It could just be deep feeling. You have deep feeling and something in you is very activated or very triggered. And that is, you're on this call because of deep feeling. And I'm sure a lot of you are involved in this work with Zioness, partly because of a deep concern for anti-Semitism and a deep concern for the future of the Jewish people, which I imagine is based something on the history of either your families or the collective, that somehow the collective history influences what we care about. And so I want to also validate that different people experience things in different ways, that what I'm describing is not going to be one fit all for the same people. But I do, as I'm sort of reading the different comments that people are writing here, I'm noticing there's a lot of feeling and there's a lot of passion, and that is like a hugely animating force. And at the same time, sometimes when we're feeling like totally overwhelmed by something that someone has said to us or something that we've seen or a direction, it can actually inhibit our ability to really fully enact our passion, because we're so kind of caught up in stuff, and it can be really difficult to sort of act. And also to just note, if we don't take note of our feelings and really attend to them, the risk is that we could also in some ways become a little bit oppressive in how we express ourselves. That in our traumatic response, we could respond to someone in a way that we lash out and that we sort of damage a relationship because we're feeling so much and it's touching on stuff deep inside of us, and our response might not be the most conscious response. And that's partly the work that I'm really interested in doing, is around building resilience so that we can really stand for our position, but also we can stand for our position consciously, and that we're not being held back or tied back by too much of this intergenerational trauma. Because the goal is to kind of release it and to say, okay, this is what I'm carrying, but I don't need to have that same level of the fear that my ancestors were facing in Poland or in Germany, wherever they were. That was deeply real. And what I'm seeing now is deeply worrying. But I have that ability, because of the distance in time, to have a little bit more consciousness, a little bit more awareness, and that can actually allow us to act more productively in the world. I'm loving, people are writing so many beautiful things, and Jewish kids on campus don't have the support. Yes, I think that's very important to give young people support, and there's so much here. And Phyllis is saying, it's because I'm a trauma therapist and my community is aligning only with the Palestinians. This is a disservice to Jews seeking support and mental health services. Right. That also one of the other trauma responses that I think is worth naming, that for many Jewish people, the effects of the Holocaust were so devastating that one of the responses is also to actually have so much empathy for the other, to have so much empathy for Palestinians that actually empathy for Jews gets lost. That's also a trauma response, I would argue, that Jewish anti-Zionism could also be understood as a form of Jews coming to terms with our historical trauma and almost denying self-compassion and self-empathy and totally putting all of that on the other, and almost projecting Jewish suffering onto Palestinians. So that's something that I observe, and I think it's really interesting to kind of unpack it, and also somehow have compassion for Jews, even, and all people, even when we sort of deeply disagree with them, and understand where their responses are coming from as well. So, yeah, I wanted to just disagree. Jeff disagrees. Wonderful. It's always Jews. Yes. Right. There's lots of disagreement, and that's totally welcome. And there are so many more discussions to be had. So, right. I'm seeing so much on the chat, and I kind of want to respond and listen, but I can't respond to everything that everyone's writing. So I appreciate all the passion, and I want to just now shift into a little exercise to do with resilience and how we can really, really ground ourselves in this moment, and with the immensity of the trauma that can be evoked, or the frustration that people are feeling. I want to take us to nature, and there's been a lot of research and a lot of psychological work around how nature can be a tremendous ally and support when it comes to trauma, because trauma is like this overwhelming thing where we feel not held, and when we connect with nature, one of the experiences is that we actually can be held by the expanse of nature. And so I don't know where people are in the world, but first of all, I would just advocate, if you are feeling one of these responses in relation to something you're seeing, taking time to go into nature, it can be a tremendously healing and helpful as a way to hold what you're experiencing. And if you don't have the ability to do that, and sometimes, we're in a busy day, we're working, I want to offer a moment now of a little guided visualization of how to connect with nature in the moment. So if this feels right for you, this is an invitation. If this doesn't feel right, no pressure to do it whatsoever. So I'm just going to invite you to close your eyes if that feels good, and to picture a place in nature where you feel comfortable, where you feel at peace, where you feel held. And that place could be somewhere in the land of Israel, in the land of Zion, in the land of Zion. Could be a place that you've been there, or a place you've seen pictures of. Or it could be somewhere in America, or anywhere else in the world. And if there's no place that comes to mind, it could just be your imagined earth spot, an imagined place in nature where you feel held. So just take a moment to visualize that place. Connect with it. Feel it. What does it look like there? Are there any smells? Is there a temperature to the air? And as you go to this place, I ask you to call to mind a moment in the past few weeks or month where you felt activated in some way, triggered, upset, frustrated, shut down, confused, in relation to all the work you're doing. A moment where you felt that. And just bring whatever that feeling is in your body, and imagine that you're sitting in this place in nature. The feeling doesn't necessarily disappear, but just let whatever feeling that is you're having from this memory, just let it be held by the expansiveness of this spot in nature. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Thank you,
And
Daniel.
I appreciate. Yeah.
Yeah. Guys, I'm gonna find out from Daniel what the best way is to contact him, and I will share with this group if anyone would like to reach out to him or is interested in connecting more deeply. You know, a lot of us really draw strength from this practice and acknowledging the ways in which this kind of advocacy is painful, especially those of us who have been recently activated because of some painful moment that we experienced, or rising concern about what's going on in our communities. But that said, I do want to also hear from some of our activists on the ground, our amazing chapter leaders who have been on the front lines doing this work with us. So we are going to kick it off with Linda Geller. Linda?
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. We've been talking about it, but I would like everyone to cast your mind back a couple of weeks, which for many of us, given what we've been hearing from Daniel and others, it almost feels like a lifetime. At that point, the ceasefire had been signed, but all of us had lived through so much of that shocking level of anti-Semitism with the attack on the diners in Los Angeles, New York attacks, and down here in Boca Raton, where I am, very noisy, violent protests beyond that with cars and banners going through the major Jewish shopping area, clearly trying to identify Jews. So we all felt that fear and trauma. And in this context, there was a letter that was sent to President Biden from 500 Democratic staffers. You may remember that. They signed on to this letter to encourage him to take a tougher stance on Israel and hold it accountable for its actions. That's a quote. It implied in the letter a moral equivalence between Hamas and Israel, never stating that Hamas is a terrorist group. It highlighted the popular idea that Israel's response was not proportional and that the blame for the conflict clearly fell on Israel. So out of interest, I decided to skim the list of those who had signed the letter. I happened upon a name that I see every morning in my inbox. She's the person who sends out a collection of relevant news articles from a key progressive organization called Progress Florida in the state. And it goes broadly across the state to all kinds of progressive organizations. Progress Florida fights for social justice, economic fairness, reproductive freedom, healthcare reforms, environmental protection, all those things that a Zionist would be interested in and want to fight for. In the past, in the context of my leadership in some other groups, such as the League of Women Voters, Reproductive Freedom Coalition, National Council of Jewish Women, I had an ongoing relationship with the people in Progress Florida as I participated in their coalitions. I had took some leads on some issues there. I did a PowerPoint for them. So I knew the people involved. And although since the pandemic, I hadn't been in contact with them, direct contact, this was a long-standing kind of context and relationship. The fact that one of their staff had signed the letter troubled me greatly. So I wrote the two key principal organizers in the group. And I think I can best give you a flavor of the interaction by reading a few excerpts from this exchange of emails, and it'll put the result into context. Dear Damien, I know I haven't been in touch for a while. However, I've continued to welcome the morning Progress Florida daily clips I receive to keep me informed about what new outrages have transpired in Florida, and there are plenty. I noticed they are being sent out by Sarah Scully. I've never met her, but presume she's the same person who signed the extreme letter that was sent to President Biden yesterday. And then I went on to talk about Zioness, because I presume that most people don't really know us. Few groups do, most don't. Zioness, an organization, came into being because there was nowhere for progressive Jews to participate and still openly support the existence of Israel as a Jewish democratic state. And I refer them to the website. We have argued that this exclusion based on anti-Zionism, Zionism being the simple right of Israel to exist, is really a manifestation of anti-Semitism. Obviously, just like Black and brown people don't want to participate, even if they were allowed to do so in a racist organization, Jews will not and should not participate in an organization that promotes anti-Semitism. After the surge in anti-Semitism on the streets of America and European countries during the last couple of weeks, the concerns that we have had for several years should be evident to everyone. Even the US is becoming a dangerous place for Jews, and unfortunately, it is not just the Jan 6 crew that is creating that danger. Of course, I'm not attributing to Progress Florida or either of you the views expressed by another member of your group. I'm just drawing this to your attention. We are all free, we all have free speech and can sign and say pretty well what we like. However, I don't think anyone on the left would like to think that instead of promoting inclusion and diversity, they are making life more dangerous for a group of people who have stood shoulder to shoulder in the fight for social justice. At least I hope not. Didn't take very long before I got a brief response. Hi, Linda. Always good to hear from you. John, our clips crew, is on extended leave and Sarah is filling in his absence. We're glad to hear the clips continue to be a valuable resource, even if the news isn't often good. Thank you for sharing your views and for continuing to advocate. We appreciate your perspective and insights on this issue. Hope you're well and look forward to keeping in touch. You can well imagine my reaction to that. I was more than outraged. These were people I'd worked hand in glove with over a number of years. So I wrote back. Thanks, Damien, for the clarification about Sarah, but I must admit your inappropriate response made me sad. The next time someone contacts you with concerns about growing hatred towards them as a community, whether they are Black, Asian, or Jewish, sympathy and commiseration would be a better response at a minimum. Anti-Semitism is no more a perspective than is racism. No, I am not well. I am worried when my friends have to remove any physical identification, a Jewish necklace, a skull cap, because they are afraid. I expect some allyship from friends. I don't know, Daniel would think I was hitting out at him, but that was my feeling at the moment. He responded, let's talk. And talk we did for close to an hour. My final email had been very upsetting to them. They apparently spent a long time within the organization talking about it among themselves. He was extremely apologetic. I explained over the course of that hour why this had troubled me so much. They asked whether in the future, if they ever had any concerns or questions about their actions when it came to such issues, could they contact me? Obviously, the answer was yes. A couple of days later, they sent me unsolicited the statement condemning anti-Semitism from the Florida Democratic Party. I wrote back thanking them for thinking of me and added a little info about South Florida Zionists, what we're doing on the domestic policy front, which happens to be working on the expansion of Medicaid in Florida. I also sent him the article that was in the Times of Israel that quoted Amanda extensively and explained the concerns about not being supported by our progressive friends. I thanked him again for the conversation and added, I'm sure my reaction must have been a shock to you. If you read this article and see it in context, it will probably make more sense and also understand why I so appreciated the conversation we had. So that's the story. I don't think they will forget the conversation, and they are central enough to progressive politics in the state that our conversation may spread out further. I guess my message is, don't be afraid to be direct and hard-hitting if you want to have an impact. Of course, I had the advantage of having a history with these individuals. They knew me and I knew them. Yet they had never seen me in this way, and it was important that they did so. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda. Yeah, really, when Linda shared that with us, we were just really impressed that she was willing to stand up and have the hard conversation, and so glad that sometimes when we have built relationship that we can have these hard conversations and people will hear us. So it's making a difference piece by piece, and we're really grateful for our activists who are willing to step up and do this. So on that note, I would like to hand it over to Donnie Fisher. Donnie.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Linda, for sharing your story. Mine is indeed a little more personal, more micro level. I sit here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, originally from Northern California. And for about 20 years, I was disengaged, disconnected, and frankly, to use Daniel's trauma-inspired words, hiding from engagement in progressive activism because I was told there was no room for me as a Zionist. And that is a non-negotiable part of my identity. My family is literally on the wall behind me. That's my history. But from 2016 onward, living here in Minnesota, starting with the death of Philando Castile in the suburbs of St. Paul at the hands of police, to the nationwide rise of white nationalism, to our community's complicated relationship with my current member of Congress, to the death of George Floyd 10 blocks from my house, again, a Black man dead at the hands of a police officer. All of this is very complicated. I could no longer remain silent in the face of all of this. But I also felt shoved out of movements that demanded litmus tests for Zionists. So when I found Zioness 2-3 years ago, it honestly brought me back to where I have always been. I think Amanda started by saying that Zionism and progressive values are interwoven, but to me, they're not two threads that we have to weave together. They're actually two ends of the exact same thread, unbroken. Zionism is, as she said, the original progressive value. And I just needed to hear that from somebody, or in this case, somebody's. Zioness has actually given me both the language and the courage that I had previously lacked. So in this last month, Linda talked about how everyone has talked about how traumatizing it has been to see our allies in social justice movements seemingly one by one deny our collective story as Jews by declaring sympathy for the Palestinians over the Israelis, denying the humanity of both peoples and shared claims to one piece of land. I did something that felt a little scary, but that I, again, could not have done without Zioness, and that was to reach out just to personal friends, neighbors on social media. So not engaging in a broader social media war of words with strangers, but to people who I know, with whom I have relationships, whose I know domestic and global ideologies align with mine, but who had posted things about Israel that differ from my own knowledge, experience, and views. And I simply, using Zioness language, offered my perspective and asked if they would be willing to listen. And to a person, they were. So we've had, I can't tell you how many direct messages I have in my Facebook inbox, but I've gone on walk and talks with most of the people to whom I reached out. There were about 5. We engaged in real meaningful conversations. I have provided them with suggested reading material, and I know that I could not have had these conversations. I wouldn't have had the courage. I wouldn't have known that behind me here in Minnesota and nationally, there's a community that has my back. And I wouldn't have had the language to move proudly and confidently as me. I am working actively locally on both support for my personal social justice issues at this moment are the rights of immigrants and refugees, as well as anti-racism. And that's something that I can now do as a Zionist, so I can be me in those spaces. And it wouldn't have happened without Zioness. Anyone who's here in Minnesota, please join us.
Thank you so much, Donnie. And I can tell you one of the joys of my job is that I get to hear from folks around the country who are having these conversations, engaging in progressive spaces. And Karen, that's a great question. We have a training called How to Talk Like a Zioness. And we have an event called Our Zionism Will Not Be Silenced. And we have developed resources, trainings, guides. So reach out, that's what we're here for. We're here to provide the infrastructure and tools to support you guys being as effective as we can be. And use, the language that is going to speak best to your audience, which are the progressive partners that we've stood next to for years and years. And to someone's point, there may be some real internalized anti-Semitism there. And there also may be folks who are willing to listen or, can have an aha moment and see something new for the first time. But either way, we do this together. We do this as a community. We share language, we share wins, we share stories and resources. And as we do this, we build the movement. I will say one of my real joys from this process is at the top, just seeing everyone saying shalom from around the country and even the world, that there are people all over who are willing to take some time out of a busy day to come and connect here and be a part of this, because this is so crucial for the future of our people. Anyway, really, really appreciate that. In the interests of time, we did have one other chapter leader who couldn't be with us and had recorded a video. If anybody will be sending out the recordings, and I think what I'd like to do is send out that recording as well for you all, so you can see it and hear from her, because she is an amazing Zioness and advocate and human. But because it's getting late, it's almost Shabbat. What I would like to do at this point is just to close by saying a few words. As you have heard from us throughout, and from Amanda at the top, we are building connected communities of Zionist activists who are progressive, who are not ceding the liberal spaces, the college campuses, the think tanks, the folks who write op-eds in the New York Times. We're not ceding those spaces to one point of view. We're going to share our point of view. We root ourselves in telling our story from our perspective and building relationships and being consistent and showing up and engaging with our progressive partners and fighting for justice, for our values, for things that we care about, because we don't want to be excluded from things that are near and dear to our hearts because of our Zionism. Sorry, my 4-year-old is just coming in to say hi. So we believe that if you build meaningful relationships across community lines through shared activism, you can start to have conversations like Donnie, like Linda. And if you want to be a part of that, please join us. If you're looking to take action, please join us. And if you have ideas about what you see in your community, what the need is, what the opportunity is, Daryl and I are here for it. This is our full-time job, and we are overjoyed to get to connect with folks like you who are thinking about, caring about, and fighting for the things that are so deeply important to us. So it wouldn't be a Jewish meeting if we didn't have some moment of learning at the end. So what I wanted to share with you all was that in the Jewish tradition, in the last week, we read the story in the Torah of the 12 scouts who entered the land of Israel and reported back to the Jewish people on what they found. They all reported that the land was beautiful, that it would grow food and sustain life. But 10 of the scouts were overwhelmed. They said, we can't possibly inhabit the land. There are powerful non-Jewish nations who will go to war with us over it. It'll put us at risk. It'll make us less safe. We shouldn't go. They were afraid. They didn't want to have a confrontation, and they were willing to give up the land and really a nation in the hopes of staying safe. But 2 of the scouts, Caleb and Joshua, were not overwhelmed by fear. They agreed that entering the land would mean conflict, but they were willing to stand up for our people, to face conflict, face risk, face fear, in the hopes of building a nation. The 10 scouts are not named, but the names of Caleb and Joshua are remembered to this day. I actually named my middle son Caleb, because when we stand up for our land, knowing that it won't be easy,
but that it will sustain our people. We write our names into Jewish history. Turning away from confrontation might feel safer for a moment, avoiding conflict, blending in, not angering powerful groups outside the Jewish community. But the only way for the Jewish people to survive as a people is to stand up, name ourselves, claim our identity, and know that it's worth fighting for. Shabbat Shalom.